In the last episode, I told you how you get into the profession. The extra. The corridor with 100 women. The prop eggs. The number on the badge. Harriet. The first Broadway role. The review in the paper I read 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to make sure it was real. Now I'll tell you what comes after. What comes after is, and I want to say this precisely, because the romantic version of this story differs from the true one. What comes after is more work. More auditions, more corridors, more Harriet calling and saying, "Listen to me," or "This isn't for you," or "I know it's small, but it's real." And in the middle of all that, unexpectedly, without any dramatic preparation from the universe, a phone call. A phone call that recalibrates the scope of what's possible. Year 1948. I am 33 years old. It's a Tuesday morning. You know that Tuesdays carry disproportionate weight in my life. And I'm at the apartment on West 54th Street, by the window, with my coffee and a monologue I've been working on for a week. A monologue from a new play by Clara Marsh. I almost have it memorized. I'm at that stage where the text is already in the body, but isn't yet the body. It's on the border. The phone rings. Harriet. Harriet doesn't call on Tuesday mornings unless she has a reason. Harriet has a precise relationship with time. She calls when she has something to say, and doesn't when she doesn't. That's one of the things I like about Harriet. Her calls always mean something. I say, "Harriet?" She says, "Vera, I have something. But first I want you to take a deep breath." When Harriet tells you to take a deep breath, you take a deep breath. Not because you necessarily need it, because Harriet knows what she's about to say and knows how it will affect you. And if she thinks you need the breath before that, you probably do. I take a deep breath. Harriet says, "Samuel Rubin." Samuel Rubin, director. 4 films, 2 of which I'd seen, and both were good in the specific sense that matters to me. Callback in 1947. Thank you, Miss Lane. With that fraction of a second which meant something, or meant nothing, and turned out to mean something. I say, "I'm listening." Harriet says, "He's making a new film. Big. Not prestige, but big. A studio is behind it, and he wants you for a screen test." Screen test. A screen test is not a casting. A casting is 30 seconds in a room with a person behind a table. A screen test is a camera, film stock, material that goes to the studio and is watched by people you never see and whose decision is absolute. A screen test is, maybe, the biggest maybe I've ever had. I say, "When?" Harriet says, "Thursday." 2 days. I set down the Clara Marsh monologue. What a screen test is and why it's different from an audition. Because this distinction matters and is poorly understood by anyone who hasn't been on both sides. An audition. You enter a room. Before you are people. They see you, live, in space, with the energy you bring into the room. An audition is your experience and theirs simultaneously. It's mutual. A screen test, you step onto a set. There is a camera. You say text or improvise or do both. The camera records, and when you leave, your work is finished, but the evaluation hasn't begun. The evaluation begins when the footage goes to the lab, is developed, returns as an image, and the image is watched by the director, the producer, the studio chief, the assistant to the studio chief, and possibly someone whose position isn't clear but who evidently has opinions. You're not present at that evaluation. You don't know when it takes place. You don't know who's in the room when your face is on screen. You don't know if they watch once or 5 times, if they talk about what they see or stay silent, if they're interested or indifferent. You give something to the camera, and you wait. This is psychologically harder than a casting, because a casting has an ending. You exit, you release, next. A screen test has no clear ending. It continues somewhere, in the lab, in the projection room, in the minds of people you don't know. I learned through this one screen test how to manage this. The answer is the same as a casting. You give, you exit, you release. Easier said than done. Preparing for a screen test differs from preparing for a casting. A casting, you prepare for your voice, your energy, your presence in space. A screen test, you prepare for the camera. And the camera is a different receiver than the person behind the table. The camera doesn't hear the way a person hears. The camera sees the way a person doesn't see. I'll explain this concretely. The person in the casting room hears your projection, the intensity, the energy you use to reach the last row in the theater. The camera has a microphone very close to you that picks up things the theatrical hall doesn't pick up. Quiet, subtle, fine details. Too much energy on camera looks like performing. Too little looks like an absence of energy. You have to find the exact middle. To think intensely, but not show the intensity of the thinking. To be fully present, but to make that presence feel natural. That is a separate skill. I knew about it theoretically, from observation on sets where I'd been an extra, from analyzing films I'd watched with professional attention. Theory is not practice. Wednesday evening, the day before the screen test, Harriet sent me the scene I'd be performing. 5 pages. A woman who discovers the truth about something she's been hiding from herself. The scene is good. It's genuinely good, psychologically dense in a way I respect. And for a moment, I think about the fact that if this film has scenes like this, it's a film worth making. Then I stop thinking about the film and start thinking about the scene. 5 pages, 1 night to learn them. I didn't learn them word for word. I learned them situationally, understanding every moment, every sentence, every place where something shifts inside. Text learned situationally sits differently from text learned mechanically. It sits deeper, is more resistant to nerves and fatigue. At 2 in the morning, I knew the scene. At 3, I was asleep. Thursday, the studio set on Manhattan. Not Long Island this time. A studio on the west side of Manhattan, in a building that from outside looks like an office building, and from inside is everything an office building isn't. You enter through revolving doors, you're in a lobby that could be a bank, and then you turn into a corridor, and suddenly, you're in the world of sets and cameras and cables and lamps that I know, and that are mine. The makeup artist. For a screen test, the makeup artist is more important than for a stage performance, because stage performance has theatrical lighting, which on its own does a great deal of work with a face, while the camera is merciless in ways theatrical light kindly ignores. The camera sees every pore, every line, every imperfection that theatrical light graciously passes over. The makeup artist for my screen test is named Ruth. She is 50 years old, with gray hair, hands that move with a surgeon's precision, and she is silent while she works, which is a good quality in a makeup artist, because a makeup artist who chatters while applying your makeup is a makeup artist you listen to instead of concentrating on what lies ahead. Ruth is silent. She works for 40 minutes. When she finished, she turned the mirror toward me. I looked at myself in the mirror. I was myself, and I wasn't myself. I was a version of myself the camera would see as me. A more precise face, more defined, deeper eyes, more prominent cheekbones. Not makeup that pretends it isn't there. Makeup that makes the camera see a face the way the eye sees it without makeup. That is the paradox of stage and film makeup. Ruth said the one word she said during the entire 40 minutes. Ready. I went to the set. The costume for the screen test. When you go for a screen test, the studio decides what you wear, because a screen test is a test not just of you, but of you in the context of the role, and the role has its costume. My character in this film is an intelligent woman in environments where women's intelligence is noticed, but not always welcome. The costume prepared by the costume designer, a Mrs. Holbrook, a gray-haired woman who had dressed actresses for various studios for 30 years, was simple. Too simple to be accidental. Mrs. Holbrook, when I entered the fitting room, said, "Check how you walk in this before I say anything." I changed. I walked across the room. She said, "Again." I walked. She said, "Do you see the difference?" I said, "I'm walking differently." She said, "Yes, the costume decides how you walk, and how you walk decides who you are when you enter a room. I designed you a costume that makes you enter like a woman who knows. The rest is yours." Mrs. Holbrook was 80 years old when she finally left the industry. She had dressed more actresses than she could count. Her theory was that the costume designer is the first director. Before the director says a word, the costume has already said everything. I believe she was right. Samuel Rubin on set for the screen test. I'd seen him at the callback in 1947. A small man with glasses and that specific quality of attention. A looking that searches. On set, he's different. Not different as a person, different as a presence. On set, he's in his element, and you can see it in how he stands, how he speaks to the crew, how he looks at the monitor. He came to me before the test, said, "Vera, do you know the scene?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Forget it." I looked at him. He said, "You know what happens in it, but when the camera starts rolling, forget that you know. Let it happen for the first time." That is a director's instruction that sounds like a paradox and is an absolute truth. To know the text and forget that you know, that is a state theatrical school describes, but that you can't learn except by doing. I said, "All right." He said, "Ready?" I said, "Yes." The camera began to roll. What happens when the camera rolls for a screen test? I won't tell you what happens technically. Takes, lighting, sound. I'll tell you what happens inside, because that is information that doesn't exist anywhere. First take. I feel the camera. That is, I feel its presence as something external, something that observes, and this awareness is a micro-thin thing, but it's there. I say the text. The text is in the right places. It's technically correct. Rubin says, "Again." Second take. Less camera. I begin to forget it's there, not because I've calmed down, because the scene is starting to be more important than the camera. The woman in the scene is learning a truth. The truth concerns her. When the truth truly concerns a character, the camera stops being a problem. Rubin says, "Stay there." Third take. There is no camera. There is the character. There is the truth. There is the moment when the character understands something she didn't want to understand. Rubin doesn't say anything for a moment after that take. Then he says, "Thank you, Miss Lane." And I know, this time I know, without a fraction of a second of doubt, that that fraction means something. 2 weeks of waiting. 2 weeks is the time during which footage goes to the lab, comes back as an image, is watched, and a decision is made. 2 weeks is also the time in which a person who is waiting can do various things with herself. She can sit and wait actively, which is a form of torture, or she can live her life and wait passively, which is a form of discipline. I want to tell you about what the actress's mind does during waiting, because the actress's mind during waiting is It's territory that requires management. Waiting after a minor casting is one thing. I'd learned it over years. You exit, you release, next. But this was a screen test for a major film with a studio contract in the background. A mind that isn't managed does something specific in that waiting. It builds possible scenarios. All possible scenarios, including the negative ones, which are always more detailed than the positive ones, because imagination in fear is more productive than imagination in hope. I saw myself receiving a no, and what that no would mean for my career. I saw myself in another year of smaller roles and corridor auditions. I saw myself doing the mathematics of surviving the month. All of this was possible. The technique I'd developed for managing that mind during waiting is simple, and it works. When a scenario begins to build, you notice it. You don't fight it, you don't push it away. You notice it. I'm building a scenario. And then, you return to what's in front of you. The monologue, the coffee, the window. Whatever is real and present. Thought about the future doesn't change the future. Work on what's before you can change who you are when the future arrives. I returned to the monologue. Harriet called after 14 days, 8:30 in the morning, which meant she'd had the information the previous evening and held on to it through the night so I could sleep undisturbed. A form of care that Harriet expresses rarely, and which I recognize precisely by that rarity. She said, "Vera." I said, "Harriet." She said, "Ruben wants you for this film." I won't tell you what I felt in that moment, because it's untranslatable into words. I can tell you what I did. Nothing. I stood in the kitchen with the phone at my ear and was, for a moment, absolutely still. Not from shock, not from disbelief, but from the kind of silence that comes when something you wanted very much and waited for very long and believed in when you had to believe, when that thing is finally there. Harriet waited. I said, "Tell me the details." And Harriet told me the details. The details were such that instead of sitting, I stood up and began pacing the kitchen, because certain information requires movement. Film, Evening Star, studio production. Not small, not off. A studio production with a budget that is a budget and not a wish. Role, lead, a woman who knows things. Samuel Rubin directing. Principal photography begins in 6 weeks. In 6 weeks. And there is something else. Harriet says this carefully, in the tone of someone who knows this is large. The studio wants to talk to her about a contract. Not a contract for one film. A contract. A studio contract. Let me explain what that is, because a studio contract in 1948 is an institution that is already almost fading. The fashion for them was strong in the 30s and early 40s, and now the system is beginning to change. But when Harriet says those words, I know what they mean. Studio contract. The studio pays you a fixed weekly salary, regardless of whether you're shooting or not. In exchange, you can only appear in that studio's films. You can only do what the studio agrees to. The studio decides what roles you get, what advertisements you sign, what you say to the press, and sometimes, how you look. That last part is something specific, and I'll return to it. Financially, the security an actress without a studio contract doesn't have. A weekly salary independent of whether you're in production or between productions. The end of waitressing. The end of the mathematics of surviving the month. Artistically, compromise. The studio decides. Not always badly, but it decides. Harriet says, "I know what you're thinking." I say, "Tell me what you think." She says, I think it opens doors. I think you have a strong negotiating position because Ruben wants you, and the studio wants Ruben. I think you should go to that meeting with a list of things that are not negotiable. I say, what things? She says, you'll decide that yourself. But decide before you enter the room. That's Harriet. The meeting at the studio. Not the set with cameras and cables and Ruth with the makeup. The other wing of the building. The one with offices, with carpets, with windows looking onto the central courtyard. At the table, the producer's lawyer, the lawyer's assistant who has a notepad and doesn't take his eyes off it for 2 hours. On my side, Harriet. Harriet at a negotiating table is... I won't say she's different from Harriet over coffee at Manny's, because she's the same person. But something in her is different in the sense of focus. Complete focus. Precision. Every word she says before saying it weighed and accurate. The producer says pleasant things. He says the screen test was outstanding, that Ruben is enthusiastic, that the studio is excited. Pleasant things which are true and which are also part of the negotiation. Because pleasant things at the beginning have a function. You enter softly before saying what you actually want. Harriet listens to the pleasant things politely, and when they end, says, describe the proposed contract to us. They describe it. I listen. I don't nod when I disagree. I don't shake my head when I dislike something. I react minimally, because your face in negotiations is information, and you manage information. That is also acting. The studio's proposal is standard for 1948, and standard is the key word here. Standard means favorable to the studio, because the studio sets the standards. Harriet says, we have a few points to discuss. And we begin. What we negotiated, because this is interesting for anyone who wants to understand how this industry worked. First point, the appearance clause. The studio wanted a clause giving them the right to alter my appearance, hair, weight, and possibly my name. Hair and weight. With certain limitations I could accept. Name? Absolute no. Vera Lane is my professional name and it's mine. Harriet said, Vera Lane stays. The producer looked at me, said, Lane is good. We can work with that. That was my first victory in that room. Second point, control over roles. The standard contract said the studio could assign me roles without my consent. I wanted the right to refuse roles that contradict what I am as an actress. Not the right to choose roles, the right to refuse. Harriet, 3 refusals without contractual consequences per year. Producer, 1. Harriet, 2. The producer thought for a moment, said, 2, but with a clause that the studio may ask for a reason. Harriet, it may ask. An answer is not required by the contract. Producer, fine. Second victory. Third point, the press. The studio wanted control over what I say to the media. I understand why. Studios have an image to maintain, and an actress who says anything to any journalist is a threat to that image. Harriet negotiated limiting that control to matters directly related to the studio's films. Private matters, mine. Political matters, mine, except where they directly concern the studio. The producer sighed in a way that said he knew he was losing this point, and that it cost him something psychological. He signed. Third victory. Salary. I won't tell you exact figures because that would be indecorous, but I'll say this. Leaving that room, after 2 hours of negotiation, I had a contract that paid me an amount that made my monthly survival calculations obsolete for several years. Several years of certainty. After 7 years without certainty. Harriet outside the building when we left. The only moment when something changed in her face, the only moment when that precise mask of professionalism slipped a centimeter, said, "You did well in there." I said, "You were leading." She said, "You knew what not to give away." That was true. I knew what not to give away because before I entered that room, I told myself what was non-negotiable. And I held to that despite the room being large and the producer being pleasant and the lawyer's assistant writing in his notepad and everything having an aura of formality that could make you concede to fit the aura. I didn't concede. That's a lesson not just from contract negotiations,